Waiting for you down there. You seemed like you were in a long, intense lawyers meeting.
Management meeting.
Or I don't know if you're just having lunch in there or what you're doing. But
Yeah, we're just pretending to work.
is that like the running of the firm type stuff?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we tried to carve out Wednesday for operations,
Uh-huh.
and Friday for finance, and Monday for marketing.
Well, today is also a day to talk with you about civil rights, which is a big sort of umbrella issue, obviously. But you're going through a case right now that sort of grounds us in something specific. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about this case that you sent me, some details of, which is of a kid getting bullied racially at school in Santa Barbara. Is it a public school?
Yeah, Santa
Okay.
Barbara Unified School District.
So how do cases like this come to you, and how do you move through them? Because it seems like these sort of cases happen all the time, but they don't always end up in litigation or a case happening.
Some cases hear about us through, or some potential clients hear about us through friends and the community and just our general reputation. And others will Google, and like our results in past, like school bullying cases will come up, and discrimination cases. This one's egregious in the way that there were so many incidents of racial violence during Black History Month.
Oof.
In 2022 in Santa Barbara Unified, mostly across their junior high schools.
Are there, and this is a Black student that experienced this, and how does the case come to you? Like the parents are concerned? Where does it generate?
Yes, so multiple Black students were affected, mostly boys, and the parents reach out to us, and then we have the discussion, because it's obviously a really sensitive situation when you have 11, 12, 13-year-olds who are experiencing bullying on campus.
Yeah. What kind of bullying are we talking about? It seems like there's a wide range of things we call bullying, and then there's sometimes these things cross the line into harassment. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the difference, because I don't think everyone knows the difference between those two things.
Yeah, and they're defined separately under the law. So bullying is now illegal, but we don't still, in the way that it's prohibited by statute, but we don't still have all the same civil recourse that we do when you have harassment, which is defined as more severe behavior and or behavior that is occurring over a period of time that's targeted based on someone's either membership in a protected class or some other
So
characteristic.
bullying elevates to harassment if the person that's being bullied, in part, is part of like a protected class of people. And that might be race, gender, sexuality, those sorts of things.
Yeah, in certain areas of the law, the California Education Code has a separate section to protect students from being harassed or discriminated against, and sometimes that's just what we commonly refer to as bullying, based on their membership in a protected class, which is race, gender, and that can go either way, right? It can mean your race. You can be bullied because you're white. You could be bullied because you're Black. Same thing with gender, male, female. It's not. I think there's this common misconception that just because you may be part of the majority group, whatever that tends to be wherever you are, that you can't also bring a discrimination claim, and that's not true.
Right. So it's like, I mean, part of me feels when I read these cases, because I cringe and remember elementary school and junior high specifically. Like junior high was a nightmare.
How terrible kids are.
Yeah, they're super mean, and they're mean based on all of those things. Like, and we can talk about where that comes from, but it seems like this is a very common problem. I guess I'm sort of wondering, when and how does it become something that's legal rather than just kids will be kids kind of stuff?
We can bring legal action when the school knows or should have known that a student was being bullying, harassed, or discriminated against and failed to do something to stop it. So we acknowledge that teachers and educators, they can't prevent every little mean thing that a kid is going to do, or insensitive thing or stupid thing that a student's going to do. But when it's happening repeatedly in the classroom, like the use of the N-word repeatedly on campus, and teachers hear it and they fail to do anything to correct the behavior, then they're condoning it, and they're creating the type of environment where that behavior is accepted.
So it's the responsibility of the school to step in certain cases.
It is.
And how do you sort of How do you prove that? How do you like go up against a school? Because do these cases often end in trial, or they end in settlements?
They usually end in settlements, and that's true of all civil cases,
Mm-hmm.
right? The statistics, like 98, 99% of civil cases will settle, usually because it's too expensive and there's too much risk
Right.
to push it forward
Right.
all the way.
So civil trials are sort of rare.
They are. And where the rubber meets the road
Mm-hmm.
is if we, as the plaintiff's attorneys representing the injured or the person who was discriminated against or bullied, realize that the school, it's the district typically, who's got the insurance and the purse strings on the other side,
Right.
is not acknowledging the severity of the incident to the extent that it's worth it to the client to take the risk to spend all of those extra costs at
Yeah.
trial, which we do lay out, but we get reimbursed. And then, so it's the risk reward analysis. Is it, are we $200,000 apart? Are we $500,000 apart? Are we 7 figures apart? And the bigger the gap in how each side values the case, then the more likely it is to go to trial.
Do you use history as a guide? Other cases of like how much money we're talking about? Because this comes down to money, right? Essentially.
Yeah.
What's your experience with other cases like this?
So we use our past case examples and with that particular district and in that particular county to see, one, how things have settled in the past with that district and their insurance carrier.
Right.
Or two, what have juries in our county done with cases that we've had or that have also happened recently in our area. But we can look more broadly, especially like in this case of the race-based discrimination and harassment in Santa Barbara Unified, looking all over the country to see what other Title VI cases have been filed, how they've been filed, whether or not the defendant had a good argument later on to dismiss the case. We collect as much information as we can.
Is Title VI can you explain what Title VI is? Because
Sure.
I think we talked about Title IX last time, which is the one that comes up in my mind thinking about schools a lot.
Yes.
But what's Title VI?
So they protect just different classes, essentially. Title IX protects based on discrimination based on sex, and prevents discrimination based on sex, both in participating in sports teams, but also in providing services and protecting students who have been sexually assaulted. Those are the two broad areas of
Right.
Title IX. Title VI is protection based on race-based discrimination.
Talk to me about Santa Barbara and race, because I mean, I went to school in Santa Barbara, UCSB. I'm from Ventura. Santa Barbara has always occupied a certain kind of place in my imagination in terms of it's a weird place. I mean, for those that don't know Santa Barbara, it's a combination of many things.
Yeah.
Like I really don't know how to describe it other than like it's a Mediterranean sort of tourist town. There are lots of rich people and celebrities there, but there's also having lived and worked there and gone to college there's a pretty robust like working class in Santa Barbara as well. But I think of it as kind of like a bougie white person's playground. What are the public schools like? How is that? Because hearing this, I wasn't surprised, honestly, about like black kids facing bullying and harassment and racist stuff at school in Santa Barbara. That didn't shock me. I don't know what your context is.
Because
for
the
it.
black population is very small
Yeah,
in Santa Barbara.
right.
It is.
Yeah, I mean, it's smaller than Ventura, I would imagine. And going to high school, we had like 1 or 2 black kids in our whole school.
Yeah.
And there were like 1,000 graduating seniors.
It's true when I was there too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and again, their harassment goes a million different ways. But I figured that experience, I would expect some harassment, bullying, a problem there.
And so I believe right now that the Hispanic and white student populations in Santa Barbara High School is pretty close.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And that black students are the significant minority. And that's been true in cases around the country where this degree of severe like taunting, discrimination, and harassment has happened toward black students and black families. We've talked to many black families who have been here over multiple generations, and they all say that sometimes themselves and also their kids have been through discrimination based on race, and that they all feel that it has not been meaningfully addressed by the school. And when you look back over the court record also, it's true. I mean, we went back in our pleading, we referenced a civil rights case against Santa Barbara Unified in the 1990s for failure to curtail this type of discrimination and then creating the environment that allowed it to continue. So it's been going, we're making the same allegation now. So it's been going, the same allegation was made in the 1990s. So we're saying, look, even though it was raised formally in a civil rights litigation in the 90s, nothing has gotten any better. And that's not acceptable.
Well, yeah, I mean, it seems like if we're the law firm that's going to help a family achieve some kind of justice against the school for this negligence, is that one way of putting it?
Yes.
Then, it seems like it's just a cycle of like of just kind of getting justice for the individuals that experience this forever. In other words, like, is there any faith that Santa Barbara School District won't just, pay out and the problems continue? Because it seems like, how do you address this?
So there's a lot of different tools. That's a great question, right? We talked before about the difference between the criminal justice system and the civil justice system, where the criminal justice system has the power to take away somebody's liberty, and the civil system only has the ability to give them money to try to make them whole after they're injured, which is a misnomer, but it's the best way.
Or take money away from someone,
Correct.
right? Like
Correct.
that. I guess that would be the justice a little bit too.
Hit them in the pocketbook.
Right.
Yeah, we hear that a lot, and that can affect change. In fact, a huge settlement that hits the news, especially against a public entity, can have a way of bringing out change via the political pressure that ensues. But ultimately, we can't ask a judge to fire, a bad actor, a discriminatory principal, for example, as part of our civil litigation. However, there are other means too. The Office of Civil Rights, we make complaints often and help our clients make complaints to an administrative agency like the Office of Civil Rights, because they have their own investigative power, and then they can come in and put a public entity like a school district under a continuing order to improve. So
then you have state oversight and that sort of thing.
Yep, we see it in our jails and our prisons a lot. When we have inhumane treatment or overcrowding in jails, then the court then becomes responsible to review the continuing order, at certain intervals to make sure that things are getting better.
So as the lawyers that are representing these clients against a powerful institution, your list of demands isn't necessarily anything other than money, right? You're not going to say, like, we want this person. Can you say we want these conditions changed? We want these things other than just the payout? I guess that's what I'm asking.
Sometimes we can ask for injunctive relief.
There you go.
And I don't know if you've gotten to that yet.
No, but the word injunction comes up a lot, and I'm like, oh, an injunction is when the courts step in and go beyond just like saying someone's guilty or not, and actually say you have to stop doing this. Usually, we've seen injunctions so far with like environmental cases, like judges or courts stepping in and saying this company can't have this factory here anymore, or that sort of thing. But what is an injunction in these cases?
Right. So it's similar. It's usually requested along with a restraining order, and that's not the kind of restraining order that like me may help a client with who like has had an abusive, ex-girlfriend or ex-boyfriend. That's one type of restraining order. This type of restraining order, a civil restraining order, is usually brought in conjunction with that injunctive relief, basically saying, okay, you are restrained, to use your example, polluting factory, from this operation until the court can dig in further and figure out what is going on.
Right.
So it's usually a temporary restraining order to stop the activity. In the case of race-based discrimination, you would have to come in and essentially ask the court to order a district to start engaging in certain activities, but those are much harder cases to prove that affirmative type of order. It's usually much easier to show that the other party is doing something, and you have to show the court that you would have a substantial likelihood of succeeding at trial in order to get the court to issue that temporary injunction for the district to halt a certain type of activity. So like segregation is an easy example, right? Like in a busing case, If a school district were still segregating students and busing them to different schools, then you bring a request to ask the district to stop that immediately because it's in violation of federal law in a lot of cases we've had since our civil rights legislation in the 1960s.
I was just thinking the 1960s and 70s were filled with injunctions against schools and places of work and
Business owners.
Yeah, yeah. I'm just thinking about like the parents in this case. They have kids coming home from school and reporting that this is happening. What are their first steps beyond? I mean, now they have lawyers, and we're the lawyer feels like the end point at some point. Like we have to get a lawyer, but they go through steps first. What happened, and how did they
actually
try to deal with this?
Yeah, neither student reported to the parents because adults are like this too, but kids even more so. When we're bullied, or made fun of or made to feel different, they just clam up and they don't want to say anything. So in the case of one of our clients who was thrown on the ground and white students took turns putting their knees on our client's neck and calling him George Floyd after they had been calling him racial epithets in the classroom just minutes before, his parents noticed when he was changing at home that he had visible bruising and injuries on his body, and they had to get the information out of him because no one wants to talk about such a horrific, demeaning experience, especially a 12-year-old boy.
Yeah, and I mean, I was bullied in junior high in a building not far from where we are right now, at Cabrillo Middle School. I mean, nothing like this George Floyd stuff, but violent kids attacking me in middle school. I never said anything about it, and my mom, to this day, she's like, "I wish you told me about those bad kids at school." Part of me was like, well, what would my parents do about it? It would just be further embarrassment for like my parents coming to school and like meeting with the other parents or something. It would just, that seemed more humiliating than the humiliation already.
Right. We just settled another school case up near the 7-figure mark before our client would have to go through the stress and further humiliation of a deposition. And he was beat up severely 4 times over the course of 2 weeks on a school campus and didn't say anything. And so that's everyone's first question, especially the parents. Why didn't you say anything? So, well, one, you think it's going to get worse, right? Because snitches get stitches.
Yes.
But 2, you're a kid and you're trying to fit in, and tattletaling to an adult, every kid assumes is the worst thing to do in that situation.
Yeah.
So we often have to use circumstantial evidence of what's happening in order to prove that the discrimination occurred, because the district or whoever's on the other side will often come back and say, well, if it was really that bad, the student would have complained.
That can't be. I mean, but we've learned lessons about, I mean, you mentioned like rape and sexual assault and women reporting things. I mean, we've learned deep lessons, it seems like, just in recent years about how people don't report these things. And that knee-jerk reaction that people have, where they're like, well, why didn't she say something? Or why didn't they report it? As if that's just like the automatic thing that people do, but it doesn't seem like that's true at all.
Well, we were just talking before we started recording, David, about how judgmental we are as human beings, right?
Yes.
We think we know.
Yeah.
And if somebody did something that, doesn't like comport with our impression of what should have happened, then they must be in the wrong.
Right.
And the same thing right now in a sexual harassment case, 5 women were bullied and harassed by the same, we'll just call him a chief in his department.
Mr. X.
Yeah. And it's public record. If people, inquiring minds want to know, we can put
This is in the workplace, though?
Yes.
Okay.
This is in the workplace. This is a sexual harassment case. And the other side that's representing this municipal entity will say, well, you can't really prove damages because not everyone went to therapy for that long. It's like, well, yeah, we also have lives. And it's just human to not want to face it, talk about it. You want to stiff upper lip it and power through it, especially people who have a lot on their plate and who frankly just tend to be higher performers, right? We just bury what bothers us so that we can get through everything else that we need to handle.
But you have to show damages, though, right? That's the trick. Like, not everyone shows damages for these types of things in the same way. So how do you get over that hump?
Emotional distress damages.
Because there are people who had, I'm sure you've experienced it, right? You've seen people who have been harassed, experienced even beyond harassment, traumatic things, and they don't have PTSD, and they don't necessarily have, they're not like a crushed victim. Other people might have experienced something lighter, and they're totally incapacitated by anxiety and trauma.
Yes, and so it's documented.
Yeah,
because they'll go get treated and medicated. It's hard. It comes up in cases all the time because everyone reacts to trauma differently, right? There's the adage that you've probably learned, like, you take your victim as you find him or her. Right. So if you get the eggshell plaintiff,
yes,
we call
we've
them,
done the eggshell plaintiff.
Yep, who has then every problem in the world,
Sure,
following a relatively minor kick to the shin.
Yeah,
you're still on the hook for all of those damages because you chose to kick that person's shin. Whereas another person, and if you had kicked, and that case is from kids on the playground, the Paulsgraf case that created the eggshell plaintiff rule, then if I chose instead to kick the kid next to me and they don't even bruise, then you don't have to pay any damages.
That's crazy.
Under that case.
I want to be an eggshell plaintiff.
Well, because it's to think about the public policy. It's incentivizing people not to kick other people.
Yeah. I guess that makes sense.
Because you don't know. You don't know how bad it could be. But emotional distress damage tends to be a lot like that because we don't show it. Right? We see it in treatment of veterans and how slow society was to respond to mental health treatment.
Yep.
And you mentioned PTSD
Sure.
for people who serve our country. Whereas if they got, a leg blown off, the VA is right there with a prosthetic to help them. It's just human nature for whatever reason. It's right there. It's obvious the person doesn't have a leg. This is terrible. We need to fix it. But when you have to look a layer deeper and see what kind of emotional damage is going on and dig into like the psyche, we're much more reticent to do that.
It's a very nuanced place too. I mean, in this case that you're dealing with now, the kids in Santa Barbara, there's damage that the parents noticed from physical damage, right? There's like bruises on the neck. There's like, but how do you prove damage beyond that? Because it seems like we did intentional infliction of emotional distress, IIED, in the last few weeks, and we even did the Westboro Baptist Church one, where it's like these people are showing up at speaking of soldiers, American soldiers, they're showing up at like American soldiers' funerals and protesting. Do you remember this? This is like in the, I guess it was the 2000s, because it was like during the Iraq War. And they were showing up with these awful signs and saying God hates them and all this kind of stuff. And so one of the fathers of one of these dead soldiers that like experienced this at his son's funeral filed suit against them. And it became this case about IIED. And they were like, it was basically like a First Amendment thing. Like they were allowed to do this. But I was just wondering about it, like, because it intersects a little bit with what we're talking about. There's like bullying, there's harassment, but there's also like, how do you show the damage of that? And it seems tricky.
Yeah, and a kid, you notice behavior changes. Like the child that we were talking about earlier, who we filed on behalf of, who went through the terrible George Floyd reenactment.
That's crazy.
And that battery. He would act out after in ways that his parents saw he hadn't acted before, right? Because when we bury emotions, they come out in different ways. Like some people, it can be rage. Some people just really keep bottling it up. So we use psychologists. And to the extent that our clients can and will participate, then we can later have a psychologist come in and explain, like, look at this behavior after that wasn't here before, like in anger, like let's say, like punching a hole in a wall, right? Because there's so much pent up frustration and anger that maybe they don't yet know how to articulate or work through in other ways, like talk therapy, right? We're talking about a 12-year-old.
Yeah.
So it's there's a lot of different ways, and it's specific, individual to individual, just like
right.
the eggshell plaintiff rule that we were talking about.
It's like, oh, he's listening to emo all of a sudden. There's something going on.
Is it normal or
right.
Smoking, grades plummeting, not going to school, not wanting to go to school, anxiety surrounding going to school, of course, the environment where they were harmed.
So I understand the idea of having a psychologist come and testify to all of that, but my vision is usually this is happening in a trial situation in court. But how do you do it when you're just sort of having meetings? I assume that this happens through a series of meetings, sometimes Zoom meetings.
Yeah, sometimes Zoom meetings, sometimes in-person meetings. Depends on the schedule, right? Like parents of our clients are really busy. They have more than one kid. They got to work.
Right.
They got to make dinner. go to practice, do all of the things. So we work with them, weekends, evenings, whatever needs to be done.
How do you present this to your antagonist, though? Like, how do you present it to the school district and say, look, we've got a psychologist that's willing to say this?
We do. And then just the behavior, honestly, that parents witness and that we can see too. Because we've seen a lot of cases where people have been injured and there's resulting psychological harm. So believe it or not, there's a lot of consistencies over cases that we can identify pretty quickly, even just sitting down with someone in our conference room or in the comfort of their own home or over Zoom, where we know and can identify patterns of what's going on.
But the school has too, right? Because they have experience with these cases obviously before. When you sit down with them or when you are interacting with the representatives of the school, do they seem cognizant and aware of the fact that this has been a problem before? That this is sort of an ongoing thing? It's like, here we are again, another case where we're dealing with race-based bullying at our school. It seems like they would have a kind of historical approach to it too. I don't know.
Some do, some don't. Like any place, there's turnover in leadership, right? The superintendent who had been in Santa Barbara Unified and then left, and now we have a new superintendent from when the point in time when this bullying happened in February and March of 2022. But it's like anything. There's good educators out there and there's bad educators out there. And so some people really do try to change, but then they may hit a wall, right? Depending on where their station is in the district hierarchy. But unfortunately, there's also this natural tendency, and I see it especially among public entities, to sweep things under the rug because no one wants to believe that this behavior could have happened, or certainly not that there was a discriminatory animus behind it.
It seems like they would have a deep interest, though, in having lawyers not come to them with cases like this,
They
right?
do.
Like, at some point, they would need to address this in a more substantive way than just like, oh, well, we'll deal with it as it comes.
They do, but
It seems like a persistent problem.
You're talking about a huge public entity, right? With so many people. And think of how many students are in even a smaller district like Santa Barbara Unified. And so how many times a day a student's coming into contact with a district employee? The district doesn't have complete control over every employee at every time, which is why you need strong, organized leadership to make sure that there's training in place and that there's messaging in place, that it permeates to everyone. Because we've all seen various levels of leadership in different organizations, right?
Right.
But a public entity is one, I think, strapped with certain budgetary constraints and also sometimes the desire to do well. There can be burnout, especially in the classroom for teachers who have been there a long time. The other problem
Is it the teachers that are specifically like the ones that are the front lines of seeing this behavior and the ones that are charged with doing something about it?
They're closest to the students. I mean, I think the principals too, who are great at their job, are not sitting in their office. They're out walking their campuses to see what's going on in the classrooms and with their teachers and at recess and on the playground.
Is this something along the lines of like mandatory reporter type thing, where it's like if you see something, say something, because it seems like what you're hitting at legally is a legal obligation to report a certain type of behavior.
Yes. So, and the way that the district is liable for an intentional act that's way outside the duties of a teacher, right? Like if a teacher inappropriately touches a student,
right?
That's clearly not part, we say, course and scope of the teacher's job. So why would the district be responsible for one bad apple teacher? Well, it's if the district knew or should have known. And when I say district, I mean anyone else who's working for them, both because they're mandatory reporters, but also because, let's say, a principal's failure to speak up about seeing a teacher, let's say, who strikes a kid across the face, then creates a negligence liability for the rest of the district because that principal didn't say anything. So the teacher is individually responsible for a battery and could be criminally prosecuted for striking a student, but the district's then civilly liable because the principal saw it and didn't do anything about it.
I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the kind of context of how this, the larger like social context and political context of this seems like pretty obvious when you have students that are using the word George Floyd, the name George Floyd, invoking that, because like at some point during the pandemic, I think it was 2020, right? I mean, there was just an explosion of like activism against police violence, and I mean, you remember all of this. I guess that would inevitably this stuff would show up in schools.
It did. And in fact, the Santa Barbara School District, their governing board, passed a resolution that was really in honor of George Floyd's murder, calling out racism as a public health threat, and had a number of other items on it, including some action items that the district said that they were going to follow through on to protect students from that type of discrimination. And so that's part of the basis of our complaint too, because not only did they have legal obligations, but anytime you set an internal rule, like a school policy,
right,
and you break it, and when you are the school, then that creates an additional legal liability for you.
Be careful the rules you make up for yourself in the heat of wanting to appear like you're doing something for social justice, because it seems like there were a lot. I mean, every company was putting out, if you remember, like their Instagram statements, it was like really like an extraordinary outburst, honestly, of racial awareness, but also kind of like this, we're going to do something kind of attitude. And it seems like, I don't know, cases like this represent a little bit of like what's changed and what's not, I guess.
Yeah, but unfortunately, it's the way of our society, and maybe just humans in general, right? We can just glom onto whatever the problem of the day is that's in front of us, and whatever is, as you pointed out, like in vogue.
Yeah.
What is everyone else on social media doing and caring about, as opposed to really putting value on having fundamental policies that promote fairness and tolerance.
Yeah.
And focusing on implementing those and developing those at a systemic level. That's what would have prevented this harm to our clients, is if the school district would have drilled down in what they said in that resolution that they passed July of 2020. If they had followed through on those things and figured out how to implement those systems, I don't think that our clients would have been injured almost 2 years later.
Ugh, it's amazing. I think a lot about this sort of like hashtag activism and things like that, because it seems like the connection between the impulse and then the actual like nuts and bolts, people get bored when you like, everyone wants to change the world. Like everyone wants, you ask them, general statements. You want to end racism? Yeah, I would love to end racism.
Right.
Let's do it. But then you get down to like, how would you actually do that? And it's boring to people. I mean, this is partly why I was interested in going to law school, is to sort of get into like the nuts and bolts of like, the often contradictory and messy and ugly and sometimes boring kind of bureaucracy of figuring out policies that actually address these things.
It's hard work.
Yeah.
It's not just changing, your Facebook profile for 24 hours to some
24
color
hours.
or some, diagonal line across it.
We need that, but that's not everything. It's not even close to anything.
No.
Maybe it's not anything at all. I don't know. But it's just so, to me, fascinating that this is like out of George Floyd a little bit. Like this is partly the real sort of on the street, in the schools, how kids are understanding this stuff. I mean, the fact that white kids would be like are doing this, or any kids, I can imagine lots of different kids doing this, honestly. I don't trust kids. But either way, the fact that kind of, it makes me think of, God, I think we used to, in school, people were using the words Rodney King when they were like hitting each other. And I'm like, now I'm remembering that like weird, like kids grab stuff from the culture
without fully understanding what's happening around it.
Right.
Yeah. One of our other clients in this case against the Santa Barbara Unified School District was one of a series of African-American boys who were the subject of a Tik Tok that compared each boy, like juxtaposed their face to different types of monkeys and said that they were glowing up.
And TikTok videos.
Yeah.
That's like a trail, though, of evidence.
Yes, and just photos taken from on campus, and then it was circulated at school. And back to your point, like how, was it the parents who found out or the boys that came forward? No, it was ultimately the student who told our client's parents that the video had been circulating. But one of our arguments is that it was circulating way too long, especially for it to have been circulating when he clearly knew it was out there.
And what is the platform's responsibility too? I'm sitting here thinking like, these algorithms have all these ways of filtering out all sorts of like copyrighted information stuff. they're allowing like a racist harassing of a child on a TikTok video to be circulating for days.
That's a whole nother podcast.
It is.
Yeah. Did you see the panel a few weeks ago in Congress?
With Zuckerberg.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And a whole lot of other social media leaders where, Congress wants to score their political points. But it's a huge issue when you have kids killing themselves because they're being bullied on social media. And there's no shut off switch.
No, that is another podcast, and it's a huge issue. But I did see that. I'm glad you brought it up because the Senator Josh Hawley, who I hate that guy, and yet I was finding myself like cheering him on as he was attacking Zuckerberg, and it was so awkward because Mark Zuckerberg is a very like alien, robotic sort of personality. But he was like, "Do you want to apologize to these people?" And the families that were there were families that have experienced horrible bullying, harassment, sexual assault, even. The amount of young people who are exposed to images of pornography or violence when they're very young is staggering, honestly. So, yeah.
But it comes back to personal responsibility. And a lot of our cases do, too, because that's a common defense.
Yeah.
Right?
What do you mean by personal responsibility in this case?
So that, the district could say, hey, we didn't condone this behavior. Yeah. And, in fact, as soon as we learned about it, we shut it down, which we argue differently. But they can say, hey, kids will be kids, right. Or parents should be parents and step in and regulate what their child's doing on social media, right? And so then in these tragic cases that were before Congress recently, and you have kids being bullied to the point where, they are taking their own lives because it's so miserable. There comes a point when other people noticed, especially adults, and they should have stepped in and done something.
Right. Beyond just Mark Zuckerberg.
Yeah.
It's interesting, though, because the platforms are very content with the personal responsibility thing. They're like, your kid killed himself because they got bullied on Instagram. That's your problem. Like you control your Instagram use, basically, or make sure you watch your kid.
It sounds like they need a slightly better PR message than that. But
because what's the other option? The other option is examining our long-term internet free speech idea, which is that the internet is just a free, open environment, and that's been a conversation since the beginning of what is really on here.
Look what we did with big tobacco.
Yeah.
Look how many decades it took. And people will still debate, like, is there too much regulation, not healthy regulation? But I think most people would agree that kids shouldn't be targeted, with little, like, pink Joe Camel, whatever, right? To make it.
Well, yeah, the cigarette companies are, too. Like, it was, like, very similar to social media where they're sort of denying their addictive properties while they actually secretly know that the addictive properties are there and are accelerating them with their algorithms.
It gets down to a philosophical discussion. How much red tape, or like you could say like safety padding in life do we want to put up, what are the guardrails that we think is good public policy in order to grow and raise healthy kids who can actually withstand what life is going to throw at them.
Yeah. And what the internet's going to throw at them.
Yeah. But most people will say that there's a line that has been crossed.
Yeah.
And this one, especially in the case of the George Floyd reenactment, when we have witnesses to say that teachers just let racial epithets like the N-word run rampant in the school, said, no, an adult needs to step in because the classroom and the school grounds are a controlled environment. Yeah. The school steps into the shoes of the parents when our kids are at school. And so it is a reasonable expectation that the kids are safe.
I've heard this legal language before. I'm like, the replacement of the parent. There's a legal term for that. The
in loco parentis.
There it is.
Yeah, in the shoes of the parents.
In another language.
Latin, the language of law.
That's right. Thank you, Danielle. I know you're busy, but I appreciate you climbing up here and talking about this case because this stuff to me is so important. And reading the case that you sent me and seeing the George Floyd stuff made me think a lot about the connections between kind of the big conversation and then just the actual stuff that happens at schools. So thank you so much.
Thank you, David.